Yeah, and I learn a lot every day, so it's wonderful. Yeah.
Okay, good afternoon, and welcome to everyone joining us. Fair for All is a nonpartisan organization with the mission of safeguarding civil liberties. I am Dr. Nikki Johnson, the co-director of FAIR in Medicine. We recognize that the health profession and scientific communities have abdicated some of their duty to safeguard the ethical standards of the profession by placing political ideology over science. As part of our effort to return medicine to the fundamental principles of the Hippocratic Oath, we are discussing informed consent and the harm caused when it is lacking. But there's also a role to play in public health to also inform the public about things, and a role to play as the public to not to inform ourselves about the correct with the correct information. Incoming President Donald Trump's nomination of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as health secretary has everyone talking about food additives as a cause of increased rate of chronic illnesses. Just today, it was announced that the Food and Drug Administration banned red food dye due to a link in cancer. But is this true? Are we fully informed about food additives? What are the ingredients in our foods and water? And should they be blamed for illness? Which ones are actually being blamed for illness, like red food dye? Are chronic illness rates lower in other countries that don't use these additives? Do other countries use these additives? Fair in Medicine embarks on a series of webinars to get answers to these questions and more. My guest today is Dr. Sarah Eliza Lockwood. She is an emergency medicine physician and medical toxicologist with a longstanding interest in humanitarian aid and tropical medicine. Dr. Lockwood graduated with honors from the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland and completed her residency, including a year as chief resident in the Department of Emergency Medicine at Washington University in St. Louis. After finishing her toxicology fellowship at New York University in 2006, Dr. Lockwood returned to Washington University and started an ACGME accredited fellowship in medical toxicology, after which she became increasingly involved with humanitarian relief projects. Dr. Lockwood is the medical affairs lead for the Crop Science Division of Bayer and is a passionate advocate for the role of modern agriculture in maintaining food security, alleviating poverty, and improving public health. Dr. Lockwood is a co-host of the Facts and Fallacies podcast sponsored by the Genetic Literacy Project and can be found on X at Dr. Liza MD. Welcome, Dr. Liza.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited about this discussion today because I think there's
Thank you
a lot
so
of
much for joining me, especially like this is just such a timely topic. So I'm really, really excited to learn from you. And I'm sure we'll learn a lot today and just kind of begin this whole going down the rabbit hole of information, which is what I'm hoping for. So um, let's just get straight to the point here. So many Americans place a lot of their blame on the pharmaceutical industry for high drug costs, lack of information and transparency about the effects of pharmaceuticals, and also these food ingredients, right? So, but a lot of people really overlook that good people like you, are do have positive roles here and are doing good work to actually keep people safe and inform people and to also advance medical science to help keep us safe. So please tell us a little bit about your background, one as a toxicologist, and then how you became to work at Bayer, and then just just a little bit of a background about this topic to
Sure.
start?
Yeah, so I took the scenic route through life and several different careers. When I was in college at Washington University as an undergrad, I was working backstage at a concert venue here in St. Louis called the Fox Theater, and was going to do technical theater as a stage manager and lighting designer and things like that. That was my focus. And my dad, I was about 21 at the time. My dad asked me if I wanted to go on a medical mission to Haiti. This was in 1989. And I thought that would be a really interesting thing to do. And so I went. He did medical work, and we volunteered in an orphanage where we changed diapers and fed babies and things like that. And it was the first time I ever encountered severe malnutrition. I had never seen anything like it before. And I fell in love with a little baby by the name of Fritz, who was about 5 months old and looked like a newborn because he was so malnourished. And I thought to myself, what are you doing with your life? So I went back to WashU and changed my major to anthropology, graduated, and went and taught English for a year in Poland right after the wall came down. So I saw the aftermath of the Soviet Union there, and learned a lot about communism and fascism, because Poland was the battleground for World War II, and it was in everybody's recent memory. I also realized that there was a lot of food insecurity there, because there was under that system of government, it was very hard to get fresh fruits, vegetables, and things like that. So a lot of collectivized farming had happened. Anyway, long and short, I thought maybe I didn't want to teach English as a second language for the rest of my career. So I came back to St. Louis, did pre-med part-time for a couple of years, and applied to the College of Surgeons in Ireland because they had a fantastic tropical medicine program. And as a medical student, I was able to go to Kenya and was supervised by a Belgian and Kenyan OBGYN, and was able to do an OB rotation there. So I got very interested in women's and children's health. Again, I saw incredible malnutrition, a lot of insect-borne illness, and things like that. And I thought was having a career discussion with my supervisor, because I was thinking I wanted to do humanitarian work. That's why I wanted to do that. That's why I was in medical school. And I asked her, would you advise going into emergency medicine or OB? And she said that if you train in the West and you train in OB, you will be, you can't abandon your patients when you're going on a relief mission. So I think you'll get more out of emergency medicine, because you wind up, delivering babies, but you see infectious disease, you treat broken bones, trauma, all sorts of things. Yeah. So I went back to Washington University for my emergency medicine training. I loved it. Emergency medicine is a fabulous specialty, because you see such a variety of things. And you also are the beneficiary of getting to pick the brains of some of the smartest people in the world, right? And you learn about radiology, you learn about neurosurgery, you learn about all of these different aspects, and you do a lot of pediatrics as well. But I felt like a jack of all trades and a master of none. So I decided to pursue a medical toxicology fellowship at NYU, which again was a fantastic experience. I was there for 2 years working at the New York City Poison Center, and also in the emergency department at Bellevue Hospital, where you saw a lot of immigrants, a lot of people who didn't have a lot of resources, and so you were really caring for very vulnerable groups of people. Yeah. I came back to WashU and started this program, the toxicology program. And then in 2010, the earthquake in Haiti happened. And I was, with several residents, organized the relief mission to Haiti after the earthquake. And so this is 21 years after my first visit to Haiti. And I went back and I saw that there had not been a lot that changed. And I thought to myself, what, other than, the aftermath of the earthquake, but people were still in unbelievable poverty, even though there were hundreds, if not thousands, of aid groups down there. And I was thinking to myself, what is it that is really affecting people here? How do we in the West emerge from poverty, and how do we facilitate that for countries like Haiti? And I realized I was seeing lots of food insecurity again and insect-borne illness. And if you could fix those problems, you would go a long way into helping people elevate themselves out of poverty. And so I started reading a couple of things about nutrition. And one of the things that I stumbled onto was something called golden rice. So, one of the leading neglected causes of blindness in children is vitamin A deficiency. And three grasses feed over 60% of the world's population. Those are wheat, rice, and corn or maize. And while they're really good because you can grow them in all sorts of environments and they fill you up with carbohydrates, they often are missing micronutrients. And this particular rice was genetically modified to make the precursor of vitamin A. So it would be donated to farmers as a public health gesture. They could grow it, they could replant it, they could sell it, but it was as a public health gesture to address this issue of blindness. 350,000 plus children go blind because of vitamin A deficiency every year around the world. And it's not just all of a sudden, they can't see. They start out with night blindness because you need vitamin A to work on the photoreceptors in the back of your retina, in the back of your eye. So they start out with night blindness, but then they eventually get dryness of their corneas, and the corneas actually start to ulcerate and eventually melt. And so if you can imagine what it's like to have something in your eye or a scratch in your eye, this is how that blindness develops. So it's very painful. Vitamin A deficiency also makes kids immunosuppressed and much more prone to diseases like measles. And measles has a really nasty effect on kids with vitamin A deficiency. They can get big ulcerating lesions of their faces and things like that. So unfortunately, golden rice, because of people being scared of it, because of the idea of GMOs, and we can talk about that a little bit, it has not taken off. And I think that is just speaks to the, Greenpeace has blocked it, and Greenpeace's children aren't going blind. So
what? Let me go take a little bit of a sidebar off of this, because I was actually in South Carolina a couple years ago visiting, just on a trip with friends, and we actually went to a plantation, and their primary crop on this plantation when they owned slaves was what they called golden rice, and it was heavily traded, throughout the world. It really was was like one of the few places in the world where this stuff was made, and they enriched these people obviously for generations to come with golden rice. Is this the same thing?
No, I'm not aware of that story. I will look, but no, this I don't think is the same.
Okay. So it just made me think of that, because I'm just like,
fascinating.
How long ago was this a thing? And then now all of a sudden, people are afraid of it. So okay, all right. So I don't know. I might have to go down that rabbit hole a different way.
I'm going to go down that rabbit hole. That's fascinating. Okay. That's fascinating. But this concentrates beta carotene in the kernel of the rice, and so children are getting it. If you could have a team of healthcare workers go and drop vitamin A under people's tongues twice a year, you'd prevent this, but we just don't have that workforce.
Right.
Okay. So if you could introduce it in the diet, it's like the fortification that we did in the early 20th century.
And added vitamin D to milk, and enriching our breads and other foods. Yes.
So it's something that we've done historically, and it would prevent this horrible illness. So long and short is, in 2015, so I was a section chief for the toxicology division. In 2015, I got a letter from a toxicologist that I'd known since I was a third-year resident, and he worked for Monsanto. And he asked if there was anybody who was interested in possibly coming to work for the company, because he was going to be retiring in 2 years, and he wanted to see if he could train somebody over those 2 years into his position about regulatory toxicology.
Okay.
And I thought, I don't think I want to work for Monsanto. That's kind of sounds like a kind of scary company. And then fast forward to February, when a mom who was a lawyer at Monsanto, who had a son in my son's class, said to me, Liza, there is a tox job at Monsanto. Why don't you just go look at it? And at this point, and this may be a whole sort of another discussion, but at this point, I was becoming very disillusioned with how medicine was evolving.
Yep.
And I felt like I was participating in an effort that was not helping patients as much as it could have.
Yes.
And so I was burned out, and I wound up, I said, well, okay, I'll look. And I interviewed on St. Patrick's Day of 2016. And I have not looked back. I was blown away by the company. I was surrounded by some of the smartest people I have ever met. And it was like emergency medicine on steroids, because now I was picking the brains of scientists from deep, deep knowledge from multiple different disciplines, with, deep genetics and biochemistry and all sorts of things like that. And it was global. So I have colleagues that I work with in Asia and in Africa and all of this kind of stuff. And I realized that, pesticides are critical for public health, and we've forgotten what they bring to public health.
Yes.
For example,
okay, before we move into that, I just want to emphasize that you, like me, let me just explain to the audience. I met Dr. Eliza in a space on X, and we were talking about this very thing, about how we are really disillusioned and really frustrated with what medicine has become, and that doctors are not spending time, and when just the healthcare industry itself is not focused on healing people. So I want people to understand that, working in the industry doesn't necessarily mean that you are like a part of the problem, or that we are trying to find ways to actually really return medicine to what it's supposed to be, and that is to actually get people healthy, and prevent illness. So I really want to emphasize that, that from this point on, and in the rest of this webinar, because just because somebody works for one of these companies doesn't mean that they're like the evil person. So please just don't portray people that way, and just have an open mind about all of this, is because we're kindred spirits in the fact that we really want to help people and want people to be healthy. So, all right, so let's go back. So let's talk about the history of, preservatives and pesticides. Let's talk about that. What is the role of pesticides and preservatives on disease prevention, and life expectancy? How has that changed our lives as human beings?
Yeah, so it's incredible, right? So just briefly, really quickly, the day I started working for Monsanto, Bayer bought it. And so I'm now medical affairs lead for the crop science division of Bayer. I do work with the farm side.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Yep. I'm skipping over that part. Sorry.
That's okay. No, that's okay. So that's where that came from. But I left medicine for Monsanto. And I haven't looked back, and I love the job, and I love the people I work with. But let's get into some really cool history. So in 1900, 45% of the US population farmed, and we lived to the ripe old age of 45. 5 public health advances of the 20th century brought us an unprecedented 35-year increase in life expectancy. And what were those 5 public health advances? The first one was water sanitation. People were getting typhoid and cholera and all sorts of diseases that were fecally mediated. So water sanitation and fluoridation. Vaccination, which is a 20th century, but there were a few vaccines Edward Jenner prior to the 20th century, but vaccination really took off during the 20th century. The discovery of antibiotics, Alexander Fleming's discovery of penicillin revolutionized the management of infectious diseases. food security, and vector control. And so by the year 2000, right, 2% of our population farmed and are not subsistence farmers. They're actually experts at feeding the world, which is a huge global challenge to do that in an environmentally friendly way. So 2% of our population farms and frees the rest of us up to be able to be teachers and doctors and lawyers and a whole bunch of other things. And that's just unheard of in the history of mankind.
Yeah.
Now,
yeah.
when you talk 2%, yeah, less than 2%, and 95% of them are family farmers, actually. So they do this as a profession. They are very, very good at it. They don't. People have this notion that farmers are, kind of hillbillies with a straw hat and a stock
overalls
and overalls and stuff like that.
Yeah.
No, these people are super professionals, and they are not dousing their property, their land, with chemicals and destroying their soil, because if they did, they'd lose their business, right?
Yeah. So, and they're also scientists too.
And
they have to know about crop science, correct?
That's
We've gotten some of the most brilliant people out of the farming industry and agriculture. So people, yeah.
They're brilliant. They're brilliant, and they are they've gotten increasingly efficient over the past 50 years. So we have 10,000 years of experience with organic farming, and nothing's wrong with organic farming, right? But it does not reliably feed people. So massive famines, even in the 20th century, with pure organic farming. Organic farming uses pesticides as well, which most people aren't aware of. But we've got 50 years of food security in the West because of scientific advances in agriculture. So I'll tell you a story that I think is really interesting, that has one of the things that has really made us self-sufficient in farming is the story behind pesticides.
Okay.
So for centuries, people have known that the Persians came up with Persian powder in 400 BC, and they've known for centuries that certain daisies, certain chrysanthemums, have insecticidal properties. And why is that important? Well, one of the reasons why that was important in the military was because insects, lice and fleas and things like that, were real nuisances. And it wasn't until later that they realized that insects were associated with death. And in fact, one of the leading causes of death in the military turns out to be insect-borne illness rather than war wounds. So Persian powder was sold to get rid of lice and fleas and things like that for centuries. And it is because plants make their own insecticides, right? They make their own pesticides. 99% of the pesticides you eat are all natural, because plants can't run away from you.
Yeah.
So
plants figured out how to survive, right? So they had to. Okay.
So
that makes a lot of sense.
We've taken Mother Nature in the form of pyrethrum, which is the chemical in this daisy that has insecticidal properties, and it works on the nerves of insects. It doesn't bother our nerves because we have different channels on our nerves. So it is specific for insects. We've taken this and made a whole class of chemicals called pyrethroids, which are synthetic, which are a little bit more light stable and a little bit less allergenic, because plants produce proteins that can be allergenic.
Yeah.
So fast forward to the dawn of World War II. And we know that insect-borne illness is a big deal in troops. And so there's a mad dash because there's a decrease availability of pyrethrum because a lot of it was grown in Japan. So mad dash to find a chemical that was very low toxicity for people, but had great insecticidal properties to prevent troops from getting malaria, dengue, all these infectious diseases. And a Swiss chemist by the name of Paul Mueller discovered DDT. And DDT revolutionized public health. It is the reason why we don't have malaria in the United States. It's the reason why we don't have malaria in Europe. It was eradicated using this chemical. In 1948, Paul Mueller won a Nobel Prize for the discovery because by 1953, the National Academy of Sciences had credited DDT with averting 500 million insect-borne deaths globally and 1 billion insect-borne illnesses. In 1953 in Sri Lanka, there were 18 cases of malaria. Now, farmers started using DDT on their crops because it's the first time that ever they had a very low toxicity chemical that could control locusts. So locusts are some of the most destructive crop pests known to mankind. A small swarm can eat in one day enough to feed 35,000 people for a year. So they're really destructive. So farmers started spraying it on their crops. Now, the problem with DDT was it was very similar to a broad spectrum antibiotic. You killed all sorts of beneficials as well as crop pests, and it tended to bioaccumulate up the food chain. And so, a lady by the name of Rachel Carson rightly wrote her book Silent Spring, talking about the off-target effects of DDT and how she was concerned about it impacting the ecosystem. And this launched the Environmental Protection Agency. This is why the EPA got started. Okay. And the first order of business was to ban DDT. Now, Rachel Carson knew that farmers, for the first time, had some food security, because you can lose up to 50, 60, 70% of your crops, or sometimes have total crop failure with certain pest outbreaks. And she'd lived through the 30s and the Dust Bowl and all of that when there was real food insecurity. And so she made a recommendation that farmers use a totally natural chemical made by a bacterium called Bacillus thuringiensis. Many of our antibiotics come from bacteria. And it's called BT, to spray on their crops. And it only targets specific crop pests. Where companies got smart is they discovered the gene in the bacterium that made that protein and put it in the crop. And now you don't need insecticides on crops, or very little insecticide if you get a big push. That is what genetic modification is. Mm-hmm. That's what a BT is, a GMO crop, and it reduces the need for chemical pesticides, and it's approved for organic farming, and we use this day in organic farming. Yeah.
Okay. So interesting. So that's the conundrum of GMOs are bad. But our food is killing us. So what do we do here, right?
So people think that, right? And so they've done huge numbers of studies on GMOs, and there's no evidence whatsoever that this causes any harm to people. Over billions of people have our livestock have eaten it. No evidence of harm. Yeah. Billions of people have been exposed to GMOs and no harm whatsoever.
Just the term or phrase GMOs is really, it just reminds me that we take one, GMOs are many things. They're not just like, it's not just one chemical or one genetic modification. There's multiple genetic modifications. So which one are you talking about? When you say this one's GMOs are bad, are all GMOs bad? Like, I think the conversation always needs to be a lot more nuanced than we give it. And we get these words in our head. We think they're bad. And then we start to just kind of perpetuate, it's a snowball effect every single time. And you got a group of people who are saying all GMOs are bad, and then we need to ban GMOs. And most of the time, people don't even know what that means.
That's right.
So this is like this again, this is why we're doing this, because this is a very specific GMO that you're talking about that actually did help crops survive, and so that people can actually have food security. Did we need an EPA to tell us to do this? We can debate that on a different, timeline. You know what I mean? Like that's completely something different. But did smart people need to think about how to do this with food? Absolutely. And is it a good thing? Yes. Okay. So are there, I don't want to totally interrupt your train of thought, but are there certain pesticides or preservatives you know, or preservation processes that are actually harmful to people.
So it's interesting. It depends on how you're exposed, right? So a lot of people think that hazard and risk are synonyms, but hazard means that there is a potential danger, and risk has an element of exposure, right? So if you, for example, have a shark in an aquarium, that is a hazard, right? But you can have a little kid in front of that shark in the aquarium and it's not going to pose a risk. There's a maybe tiny, tiny, minuscule risk, but it's safe enough for kids to go to aquariums all the time, right? If a kid's in an ocean swimming with a shark, his risk goes way up. So when you're looking at different kinds of how to regulate different kinds of chemistries, if be it a pharmaceutical, be it a preservative, be it a pesticide or anything like that, what you want to do is you want to do a risk assessment. What are the chances of you getting exposed to this in a significant amount that it could cause harm? Because remember, the dose makes the poison. So, for example, we have no qualms about taking the most potent toxin known to mankind, nanograms can kill a grown adult, and injecting it in our faces for cosmetic purposes to be beautiful. And the reason why we know we can do that is because if you follow the label, so the hazard is paralysis and death, right? But if you follow the label, you will have such a low exposure that you can do this safely to make yourself look pretty, right? So, and Botox is not only used for cosmetic purposes, but it's also used for real medical issues. So people with cerebral palsy and spasticity, they use Botox. People with dysphonia, the problem that RFK Jr. has, get Botox injections in their vocal cords to improve that. So,
yeah, lots of uses. Kids who have lots of extra salivary, overactive salivary glands get Botox. People with migraine headaches get Botox injections.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and absolutely, that is a fantastic point. That on this, it's the dose, right? That is a part of this discussion that doesn't necessarily get discussed. Yeah, I really hope people come away with thinking that if not one other thing, using this example to illustrate it is actually really good. And because a lot of the people who are getting Botox injections are the ones who are actually promoting these ideas about toxins in our food, right?
That's right. And so let's talk about a pesticide kind of pharmaceutical thing, right? So there are a certain class of insecticides that are called organophosphates. And most doctors don't know a lot about pesticides, but the ones they do learn about are organophosphates. And those block an enzyme that breaks down a neurotransmitter that makes you move. It's called acetylcholine, and it blocks an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase. So if you have too much acetylcholine floating around, you get really twitchy, and then all of a sudden you get paralyzed, right? But you also get too much stimulation of your parasympathetic nervous system, so your relax and rest nervous system, so rest and digest. So you get salivation, lacrimation, you get diarrhea, you get all this this is a toxidrome that's associated with an overdose of these. And so the toxicity profile of these is scary, but they're very, very critical in certain resistant pest infestations for like there's citrus greening is essentially the plague for citrus fruits, and it's knocked out a whole bunch of citrus in Florida and things like that. And the bug that transmits it is remarkably resistant to a lot of different insecticides. So chlorpyrifos is one of the insecticides that people use to treat it. So people get very worried about this particular kind of pesticide, and they want to ban them. What they don't know, though, is that in kids in the Middle East and Africa and the Horn of Africa, one of the leading into adulthood, one of the leading causes of bladder cancer is an infection, a worm infection called schistosomiasis hematobium. And these worms wind up getting into under the skin when people get into water. And they burrow through the vasculature and eventually land, and the male and the female actually become lifetime pairs and then lay multiple eggs that have a little sharp spine and irritate the bladder. And it causes lots and lots of hematuria, bladder bleeding. And eventually that inflammatory change is one of the leading causes of bladder cancer. For decades, the World Health Organization said that a chemical called mitriphenate, or triclosan is the other name for it, was on the list of essential medicines to treat this disease. That is metabolized to dichlorvose, which is a organophosphate. And it was important for preventing bladder cancer. So other acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, so other compounds that have the same feature, are the first line treatment that we use for Alzheimer's, donepezil. It's not an organophosphate, but it works the same way. They're also a first line treatment for myasthenia gravis. All the stigmine drugs, neostigmine, bisostigmine, pyridostigmine, they are carbamates, which do the same thing. And they are really important for reversing paralysis from anesthesia. They're really important for treating an anticholinergic toxidrome. There are all sorts of reasons why we use these drugs for neuromuscular disorders and things like that. So banning a whole class based on the mechanism of action really does impact medicine as well. So I think it's important for people to understand that these things are critical, not only for crop protection, and crops that get contaminated with infectious diseases can be a problem as well. So I'm sort of rambling on here, so tell me if you need me to stop. But
no, this is good. Keep going with that, and then we'll.
Yeah. So weeds can be toxic, and they can harbor fungal pathogens that can get transmitted to large populations if they get in the food supply. So let's talk first real quick about toxic weeds. So if you have, every year you'll hear about outbreaks of datura poisoning. Datura is the thorn apple or jimson weed. It grows all over the place. And its seed pod has seeds that have atropine, hyoscyamine, and scopolamine. Mm-hmm. And so if they contaminate your crop, you can wind up with large portions of the population showing up into your emergency room with what we call an anticholinergic toxidrome. So people will be wildly agitated, hallucinating, confused. They will strip their clothes off and run around naked. This will last for 4 days until they get heat stroke, seizures, coma, death. And in Martinique in 2019, 35 people showed up in the emergency department after eating organic flour contaminated with datura. Now, can you imagine having 35 wildly agitated people who are completely confused without the antidote, because there's a shortage of the antidote? And the antidote is physostigmine, which is a carbamate.
Yeah.
So you don't want weeds contaminating your food, right? Abraham Lincoln's mom died because of milk poisoning. Milk sickness. The cattle that they had got into a weed called white snake root, and that concentrates a toxin called trematol in the milk. And when people ingest it, they wind up with muscle spasms, seizures, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and they die. And that's how Abraham Lincoln's mother died. So you don't want that in your food system. Weeds also harbor fungal pathogens. So if you've got ergot, for example, ergot gets transmitted by insects to crops. And it used to cause big outbreaks where 40,000, 50,000 people in France or in Europe would wind up with St. Anthony's fire. And St. Anthony's fire is a disease. There were whole hospitals built for this problem. St. Anthony's fire, because of the way that the ergot alkaloids work, they cause vasospasm. They would cut off the blood supply to hands and toes and fingers, and legs would fall off. So if you can imagine the exquisite pain with that. Lots of miscarriages in people and also in livestock. Seizures and hallucinations. You don't want that in your crop. You want to prevent that. So if you can prevent it at the weed stage by taking care of the weeds, because herbicides have much lower toxicity than insecticides. So you prevent it at the weed stage by using herbicides. You prevent it at the insect side because they're carrying the spores to the plants, or you can prevent it with fungicides. So you want to try to get it as early as possible to protect public health. But 45,000 people would come down with ergotism. And it's interesting because ergot turned out to be the most important medicine in obstetrics. It is where methyl ergonovine comes. So they used to use ergonovine to prevent postpartum hemorrhage. In the 1930s, they discovered that chemical. And then they made a synthetic version of it, methyl ergonovine, which is in use today and has saved countless women's lives. Ergot's also where LSD comes from. Lysergic acid is the natural version, Mother Nature's version of LSD is lysergic acid. So you don't want LSD residues in your Cheerios. so there's,
so this is honestly, this is fascinating. I mean, we could talk for probably hours, and tons of medical school lectures on this stuff, and about how specific chemicals derived from nature can actually be harmful to us, but then we can turn those into medicinal uses as well, right?
That's right.
And then controlling that can also keep us healthy. So that's super, super important for people to understand that. I feel like so here's the other piece of this is so how much of these chemicals and things that we're adding to our foods and or genetic modifications that we're making in the US, how is this different from what the Europeans are doing? And and if we want to specifically just hone in the things that we're adding to foods,
sure,
to keep us safe or whatever reason that we're doing that, can we just talk briefly a little bit about that to kind of because that is kind of really the thing that's gotten people like so riled up. I mean, like, so just to kind of go back, briefly summarize. So it is the not necessarily the chemical itself that harms people. It is typically the dose or how it's used that is actually the thing that can be harmful, correct?
That's exactly right.
Okay.
That's
All
exactly
right. So then let's talk about Europe versus, Europe and other nations versus the United States.
That's that's a big kind of discussion. So let's talk about really quickly the things that I hear worries about. I hear worries about pesticide residues. I hear worries about food additives like preservatives. I hear worries about food coloring. I hear worries about those kinds of things, and claims that things are different between Europe and the United States. So GMOs between Europe and the United States. Europeans generally don't use GMO technology. Now, they do not have enough protein sources for their livestock, so they import tons of GMO food for their feed for their livestock. And why is this an issue? Well, because they have been out in front talking about the risks of GMO technology, even though the literature definitively shows that it is safe to eat. It does not cause toxicity. It does not cause allergenicity. These are specifically tested for before GMOs ever go to the market. So GMOs are the most heavily tested and regulated food substances in the world.
Wait. So you're saying that the Europeans are saying that GMOs are toxic, but they're importing GMOs.
Yes, to feed their livestock.
To feed their livestock.
Yes.
Okay. And sounds a little bit hypocritical or contradictory
well, they have stoked the fears of the global community. And who does that affect? So in Zambia in 2002, there was a mass starvation, and the U.S. provided food aid. And the president of Zambia refused to accept that food aid because he was afraid that GMO technology would get into the economic. If somebody planted it and sent their crop to Europe, the Europeans would detect the GMO in there, and that would affect trade. So while the Europeans were feeding their livestock GMO, 14 million people were starving. So I think I have a big, huge ethical problem with fear mongering along those lines, because there are no health risks with this technology. And this technology is critical for food security. There's a great film by a friend of mine by the name of Scott Hamilton Kennedy. It's called Food Evolution. I'd encourage everybody to watch it if they can. It's really talks about the impact of this kind of misinformation on global food security. So anyway, so Food Evolution, that's a plug for that. But everything that goes into food, so that's the GMO component, but people get very scared also about pesticide residues. The Europeans are saying, well, the global South shouldn't be using any pesticides that we don't use in the North, in North America or in Europe, because the toxicity profiles are different. Well, that's okay if you've got the best pesticide ever, which is winter. But if you're in a tropical environment, right, you have pest pressure 365, 24/7, all the time. And so if you use the one or two pesticides that we use, you build resistance. And why is that a problem? Well, there is global warming, and you are seeing invasive species of insects moving further and further north. So, for example, the Aedes mosquito started out in Texas in the 1980s and is now all the way up in New York. And it carries viral diseases like Zika, which causes brain damage in babies. It causes dengue, which is a hemorrhagic fever. West Nile. I mean, they were talking about shutting down. Some suburb in New York not too long ago because there was a case of West Nile or Eastern equine encephalitis. These really bad viral diseases that a lot of them don't have vaccines. So vector control is the component that you need to protect yourself.
So it's really key, whatever that this is dependent on, well, the decisions we make about vector control really depend on climate. And so if you're obviously a colder climate, you're going to have winter, you're going to kill a lot of these vectors. And that way, if you're a warmer climate, you're going to have different vectors, and
that's right.
And it's going to be more difficult to control. So, okay, that makes a lot of sense.
That's exactly right. So, but even so, pesticides are heavily regulated. So farmers are not allowed to just go, oh, I've got a big crop infestation, I'm going to spray all over my crop. They have a maximum amount that they can put on the crop that is regulated by USDA and EPA. And that maximum, it's called a maximum residue limit. Then EPA and USDA take all of the potential exposure. So each crop has a limit. And then EPA takes all of the potential exposures that you could get anywhere else, fruits, vegetables, all water, air, all that stuff. And they come up with a maximum exposure limit. And that is orders of magnitude less than the non-toxic dose in animals with a safety factor built in.
Okay.
So that's called the allowable daily intake. So pesticides are regulated so people will not have a safety issue with them when they're applied to crops. And that is global. That happens in Europe. That happens in the United States. That's across the board for trade. Your crop cannot exceed that MRL. So there's that. Now, people are also then concerned about, preservatives and things like that, and a whole bunch of kind of things. They hear the names of chemicals and they get scared about this. Why are preservatives important? Well, the reason why preservatives are really important is because you've got to get that crop from the farm through a whole process. And people get worried about food processing, which is basically taking, have you ever read The Little Red Hen, which is a nursery rhyme, a nursery story?
Yeah, it's one of my favorites.
Yeah, so the little red hen's like, will anybody come help me thresh the wheat or harvest the wheat, thresh the wheat, mill the wheat?
Yeah.
And then, so that's all food processing.
Bake the dough, bake the bread, all that.
That's
Yeah.
exactly right. That's what food processing is, getting it off the land into a consumable form. And there are ways of losing crop or contaminating crop all along the way. And so you want to harvest the most that you can. You don't want to waste any of it. The food waste is one of the big topics, right? And so you have to figure out how to get it from the farm all the way into the Bronx, New York City, without insects eating it up, without it rotting, without all of this stuff. And so in the early 1900s, there was a huge amount of concern because typhoid was rampant, botulism was rampant, all sorts of bacterial infection of food and food poisoning was rampant. Upton Sinclair wrote a book called The Jungle, and it was about the Chicago meatpacking industry and how terrible the conditions were. And because of that book, and because of a group of kids who, not young kids, they were in college, who volunteered to be the poison squad because food was so adulterated, they would be the tasters of the food to find out what would happen to them because of these different exposures. That resulted in the 1906 Pure Food Act, which was sort of the predecessor for the FDA, because the food quality and food safety was so bad. If you didn't pasteurize milk, you could get, you could get brucellosis. You got all sorts of milk-borne illnesses, E. coli infections, and things like that. So these two things really led to a demand from the public to improve our food supplies. And so different things were instituted, and safety was tested in order to make it safe for food to get from the farm and not rot along the way, and not cause big, huge outbreaks of food poisoning.
Yeah. So right now there's a ton of debate about whether or not these products are necessary, or but what we really should be discussing is why the process is necessary. And you can debate on how the process happens. I have no problem with that, because I'm seeing a lot of people are like, oh, I'm drinking unpasteurized milk, or unfiltered water, things like that. I want people to get from that okay, look, if you're concerned about how the government controls or regulates, or actually or how the farmers or the industry is actually going about the process, I understand that. I completely understand that if you have that concern. But the fact that the process is necessary isn't debatable. We actually do need to keep people from getting sick. And that, like you said, the food needs to go from the farm, from the crop itself, growing in the fields, from the cow, from the water stream to, the table, and to, very far away. Like we started off in the beginning of this conversation, 2% of people are farmers, right? Humans are farmers, and we have to feed the nation so that everybody else can do other things. So those things are not debatable. I just can't entertain that kind of conversation. But we do need to talk about how we get it there, and which preservatives we add, which preservation processes we use, and how we do this differently than the Europeans. And that's kind of where we were going with this. So let's kind of let's shift back to that, and talk about specifically the additives. And then one of the hot topics is really the food dye. Read Food Digest today. We have a question in our chat that's specifically asking, was your opinion on the banning of red dye number 3? And so let's talk about that in terms of what are the Europeans doing
Sure.
differently than US in that kind of in this perspective.
So, in Europe, Europe has banned some things that the U.S. has not banned, and the U.S. has banned other things that the Europeans have not banned. So it goes both ways. A lot of times it's because of a public pressure thing, not because of a real human health risk. A lot of the things that are banned actually have completely natural counterparts that you get in your diet anyway. So a lot of this has to do with public perception rather than real scientific evidence. There is, people are concerned about all of these exposures causing an epidemic of chronic illnesses, right? So they're saying there's an epidemic of cancer, heart disease, cardiovascular diseases like stroke, obesity, and diabetes. Those are the big kind of class of diseases that people are worried about. Those are all happening globally. So whether or not you've got the same pesticides, whether or not you've got the same additives in terms of preservatives or food coloring and things like that, Europe is having an epidemic of cardiovascular disease, cancer, and obesity and type 2 diabetes as well. And this is also in young people. I'm going to take back the cancer part because cancer is not really, it has been pretty flat with the decrease in smoking globally. So you're actually seeing a lot of cancers in decline. And you can go to the SEER database for this. I've got infographics that I can show you that show the comparison between the EU and the United States. So the claim that the United States is doing something different that's causing this epidemic than Europe is not true. Europe's facing the same epidemic of diseases. And why are we having these diseases? Well, we're having these diseases because they're diseases of aging. We're mortal, right? And our children are not dying at the age of 5 from preventative infectious diseases because of antibiotics, vaccination, water sanitation, pasteurization, and things like and food safety programs. And I want to say in the early 1940s, a huge number of people had vitamin deficiencies, and so we started fortifying food with vitamins as well. So we're not seeing the diseases that we saw in the first half of the century. But I'm watching the House of Medicine get so concerned about these additives and preservatives and food colorings. The food coloring is not going to do much. They're safe, but they're regulated by the FDA.
So why did the FDA ban red food dye?
They did that. So there's the one red food dye, which is number 3, yeah. Okay. And they did that because the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act has a clause in it called the Delaney Clause. And if they did it for a legal reason, not for a health reason, if a product is shown in any capacity to cause cancer in animals or people, you can't have it as a food additive. So this particular chemical wound up in a study causing adenomas, which are benign tumors, mostly adenomas, benign tumors of the thyroid. In rats. And so for a technical reason, the FDA canceled this particular product and this particular coloring. People don't have the same hormonal pathway that makes rats more prone to these tumors, okay? So rats have an enzymatic pathway in their liver that metabolizes thyroid hormone very quickly. And so they tend to have lower levels of thyroid hormone. And what that does is it stimulates the hypothalamic pituitary axis. The hypothalamus releases thyrotropin releasing hormone. And then that gets the pituitary to release TSH, which stimulates the thyroid to release T4, right? Mm-hmm. So in rats, you've got a tendency to overstimulate the thyroid. And when you overstimulate the thyroid, you make those cells grow. Okay. And when you make those cells grow, you can get benign tumors or you can get it very occasionally, because of a mutation, a malignant tumor.
Okay.
So because
So
of this,
is this happening in humans at all? Okay, so no evidence it's happening in humans. There's evidence that it's happening in rats, and because that clause is in there,
and
we
it's
have
so,
to,
yeah,
okay, to ban
that's
it.
why we have to ban it. Yeah.
Okay, okay, that makes a lot of sense. Now, what is the purpose of actually, from my understanding, the purpose of having food colorants or food dyes in is really just more of an appeal to
Yeah.
people, a visual appeal to
It's a
people.
visual appeal. Yeah. It's so
Okay. It's not like a necessary component at all for anyone. So if we ban
no,
it, it's not going to be consequential
no, it's not going to be
to
consequential.
you.
Although,
Okay.
people recognize different things. So
Okay.
you recognize, a Benadryl because it's pink,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So there are
Yeah.
different things that are important for that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
lots of claims about safety in food dyes are they have all been extensively tested. And they do not cause harm to humans. The ones that have been taken, this one being taken off the market is because of a technical reason, not because of a human health risk.
Okay. That's okay. That's thank you for answering that. That's awesome. All right. And the other piece of this is like you started talking about it with preservatives. Um but there there's actually also a number or a dose that we use to measure toxic levels in food additives as well, right? You mentioned the ADI number. Can you talk a little bit about that and how it's derived
Yeah.
and then how that's different in different countries too? Um,
Yeah. So I described earlier the ADI for pesticides, but there's an ADI for all sorts of different chemicals. It's the allowable daily intake, which is the amount that you can consume by any root, for the rest of your life daily without having a health effect. So that's the just sort of general explanation for what it is. And how do we derive that? Well, you do that with a battery of tests that are done under what we call good laboratory practice. So one of the, and this is technical, so I hope it's not boring. One of the requirements for industry testing is that you have to follow very rigorous protocols in your testing, and your evaluation of the testing, because if you don't, you can't replicate things. So you hear about in the medical literature, academics doing experiments that don't wind up being replicable, right? You cannot do that if you're industry, because you've got to have the same outcome every time somebody uses your product, right? So it's got to work. And so the regulatory agencies require that industry does a battery of tests. The protocols are all developed by the regulatory agencies, and they are validated. They are audited. The EPA can come in anytime, and look at your labs and make sure that the equipment's calibrated, that the notebooks are accurate, and any adverse outcome is reportable by law to the regulatory agencies. This battery of tests takes 10 years to do. And if you're a pesticide, it takes close to $250 million. If you're a pharmaceutical, it takes $1 billion to get through all of that testing. This is before it ever gets launched or goes on the market. And from that battery of tests, they determine, it's called a hazard assessment. So they determine what kind of outcomes can happen, right? And if those outcomes, and how that impacts these animals. If an animal gets wobbly, you've got to report that to the EPA. If an animal dies, you got to report that to the EPA by law. And so these are really, really rigorous, highly standardized testing that gets done. And then what they do is they do ecotoxicology tests, looking at the impact that's going to have on the environment. They do human toxicology tests for pesticides in animals, for pharmaceuticals in people, right? Where they look at it, whether or not there's toxicity, and they benchmark a level which is the no adverse effects level, the non-toxic dose in animals. They up the dose, 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 up the dose. And the non-toxic, no adverse effects level becomes the benchmark. And then they build in a safety factor of 100 or 1,000, depending on the inherent hazard of the chemistry. So if you use the chemical according to the label, and the label is the law, if you use the chemical according to the label, you are not going to be harmed by it. If you are slightly above the ADI, which they will which you can't get to physically, right? If you're physically above the ADI, that doesn't mean you're going to have a health impact. That means that you cannot, once again, you can't physically get there. If you're above the MRL, which is way lower than the ADI, you can't put your product on the market. So the ADI is a non-toxic dose in animals. So you would have to, for example, in order to, let's take the glyphosate residues on soybeans, for example. If you're a 55 kilogram adult, in order to reach the ADI once, you would have to eat 11 kilograms of soybeans every day for the rest of your life. And you would die of soybean toxicity before you ever got to the ADI of glyphosate, for example.
Yeah.
I hope, does that make sense?
No, it makes a ton of sense. And it just also reminds me of the fact that, like, there's lots of things that we consume that can actually be poisonous. And if we consume too much of it, and water is one of those things.
That's
so, so yeah, okay. So putting that into perspective. So there are these numbers that are set to control the amount of or toxic levels of additives that go in our foods. And then we on top of that, like, we add this safety factor into it so that we never exceed that in a lifetime of normal consumption.
Yeah.
Based on, not necessarily even just labels, like we just don't allow it. So that makes sense. And I know that I've read a little bit about, like, the food colorants and, and specifically in different countries, and realize that those numbers are different for different countries. And even some of these food dyes or, and food colorants are allowed at even higher levels in Europe and other countries than what we allow in the United States. So, for people who are saying that the Europeans are somehow doing this differently, they are doing it differently, but that doesn't necessarily mean that their safety factor is higher than ours. So that's really interesting. I think that's important for people to know. It's a lot of sciencey, technology. I mean, I obviously, there's some links, put in our chat, and they'll be in the show notes for people who want to watch this later on YouTube, to kind of to read a little bit more information about this. I really challenge people to read and study a little bit more about it. So, because that's important. We all have our fears, and some of the our questions and concerns about what our government is doing or not doing are legitimate concerns, right? But we really do need to understand this a lot better. And I really appreciate you going through that explanation, because that's really helpful. Now, like, do you believe that there's a link between any food ingredients and chronic illness and humans, or is that something that we can even, we can't figure that out in one single conversation in a few minutes?
Yes, I do. Once again, it's the dose makes the poison, right? Okay. Yep. So I think if you are on the carnivore diet and you eat 4,000 calories worth of T-bone steak every night, you can get fat. And obesity is an epidemic, and you've got to be very careful about it. Just like
well, you're going to get the carnivore people are going to say the opposite thing,
right? Exactly.
But I would say the thing is too, if you're consuming a lot of any one thing,
yes,
then you're going to put yourself at a different level of risk than someone who isn't.
So
who
I'll
isn't
say
doing
to the vegans
that?
too, if you're
Mhm.
drinking your agave, fruit smoothie,
Mhm.
people talk about high fructose corn syrup. Agave is 80% fructose. And there's a whole lot I can do a whole session on high fructose corn syrup because once again there's a lot of commotion about that
Yeah,
ingredient, which is unwarranted.
we will do that.
So we
We'll
can
have
totally.
that discussion and debate too.
But if you take in huge amounts of sweet, glucose and fructose and sucrose, you will get fat. So I think that the reason why we're having an
Or
epidemic
diabetes.
or diabetes, so you get obesity and hypertension and diabetes because of lifestyle. And that's such a bummer because I would love to sit around and just chow down on chocolate chip cookies all day long. But I think that we are much more sedentary than we used to be. Remember, 45% of the population used to be subsistence farmers, and they were hungry, right? So we're much more sedentary than we used to be, and we are taking in many more calories. So I wouldn't say that it's any one ingredient. I would say that it is the dose.
Okay.
So
Okay.
that's what I'd go with.
All right. I think that's absolutely fair. All right. So before we close out, I want you to have an opportunity to just kind of summarize your key points on this topic and what you want people to know from this, and then I'll address a comment that we got in the social media chat.
Sure. So again, we've got 10,000 years of experience with organic farming and 50 years of food security in the West because of scientific advances in agriculture. We have also 5 public health advances of the 20th century that brought us an unprecedented increase, 35-year plus increase in life expectancy. And those are vaccination, antibiotics, food security, water sanitation, and vector control. And I'm watching the House of Medicine dismantle these things because of the fears of these chronic diseases and without looking into this very, very carefully. And that concerns me because romanticizing subsistence farming is really short-sighted. It's not a bucolic life. It is women and children hand weeding, and in many places around the world, they're hand weeding the jungle. When you look at the impact of bad agricultural policy, it's really stark. And where have we seen that? In Sri Lanka in 2021, Sri Lanka was sort of a middle-income country, highly educated population, wound up emerging from a civil war that lasted for 27 years, and a huge tsunami in 2004, which killed a whole bunch of people, really started becoming a beacon of how a country that had been in chaos was progressing. And they implemented some agricultural policies that were really unfortunate because agriculture is the foundation of civilization. They decided to ban all agrochemicals, so fertilizer, pesticides, all of that kind of stuff, because of fears that are generated by physicians and public health people saying that we're contaminating things. These are terrible things. And the subsequent collapse of the country was catastrophic. And I've got it pinned, the story pinned on on X. So please read that thread. But the whole country collapsed because tea is their major export, and tea pays for 71% of their food imports. And so the jungle grew in over the tea plantations, destroyed the tea, and then they had no exports. And all of a sudden their food security collapsed. And so the population within a year was in food lines, starving, overran the government. The president had to flee and for his life. And the country is still reeling. Their medical system has collapsed. Everything else, their tourism has collapsed. And it was because of mythology around agriculture. I'd like to just point out that if experts from the Food and Agriculture Organization went to the World Health Organization and said, we don't like antihypertensive medicines because they have side effects. They make us dizzy. You get erectile dysfunction. You get all of these different problems, side effects from antihypertensive medicines. And in overdose, when people try to kill themselves with it, they're lethal. These are really hard to treat overdoses. We think they should be banned. Doctors would be like, that's kind of crazy. You're going to have heart attacks, strokes, all of these kinds of things. That don't do that. Well, when you've got a much bigger physician population that thinks that they're doing the right thing by making recommendations about ag policy, but they don't know what they're talking about. And so, they've got the best of intentions, but it's the same phenomenon. So what I would encourage anybody to do, and I appreciate people so much coming to listen to this, I would encourage doctors to talk to nutritionists and to experts in ag before they make policy recommendations that have a huge knock-on impact for the most vulnerable people in the world.
Yeah, and some of them are in our own country, and I think that's fair. And it actually speaks directly to a comment that we got on our social media. And I'm going to read this, and then we'll and then comment on it and close the show. So this person, and I quote, I really don't think a physician employee rep from Monsanto/Bayer is appropriate for this topic of food safety, additives, and chronic illnesses, and justifying Bayer's farming practices in the USA. I listened for 45 minutes, so disappointed. I unshared fair ad for this Zoom topic. My husband grew up on a farm in Iowa. His best friend is a top organic farmer in Iowa. My cousin farms in Ireland. Bayer and Roundup are a threat to human health and well-being. 45 minutes in, no talk of food additives from a supporter. This was so this is a comment that we got on our social media. So I want to remind everybody what the purpose of Fair Medicine is, and the purpose of these webinars is to bring you information. We want to provide you with resources and information that you can use to make arguments and to make decisions also for your health and for your other people's health. I think the last few comments from Dr. Eliza were really about watching and witnessing how our own, not only government, but health policy leaders, our own physicians and scientists are not familiar with all of the information that is present, and we are making decisions using political pressure to make decisions that are going to affect millions, if not billions, of people's health. We should be fully informed. You should be fully informed. And so if that means I have to bring somebody in who works for a pharmaceutical industry to discuss it, then that's what we're going to do. You can take I'm not telling you to take and believe every single thing that Dr. Eliza says. I don't necessarily agree with her on every topic or other topic, but this is about bringing you information. And you have the responsibility and the onus to actually get the information and learn and seek and learn, and then bring us a healthy debate. In response to that, we welcome that. Let's have the discussion, but let's talk about all angles and what information is available. So I appreciate the comment in that respect. I am very disappointed that you think that this is not a representative of a fair medicine and what we're aiming to do, but our goal really is to inform and educate. And so I hope that other people who are joining and watching have gotten something out of this webinar today, and we'll come back and view more of them. Like Dr. Eliza mentioned, the conversation about high fructose corn syrup. We'll talk about fluoridated water. And some other
Roundup too. I read
Yeah,
it.
that we
I
can go
read it.
into and dive into, and we can have a healthy debate about whether or not, how policy is formed around these things. And so, but I don't think we should be dismissive of people based on the industry that they represent or work for at all. All of us has something unique to bring and a unique perspective. So hopefully people can stay open-minded about that. Um, so I want to thank Dr. Liza. Thank you so much for giving me your time today, your expertise and knowledge. And the Dr. Liza's contact information, her X profile is in the show notes, and as well as the podcast that she co-hosts is also, in the show notes as well. So if anybody's interested in connecting with her, feel free. Also, if there are questions that you have specifically for her, comments you want to make to her, you are able to send those to us through our FAIR links as well, and those are also be in the chat. A reminder, FAIR is entirely dependent on donations from people, excuse me, like all of you who are attending and who support us. We strive to offer programming and educational information that helps bring awareness and also solutions to problems in healthcare and health policy. So we hope that you consider supporting us, continuing to watch and share our work, but also support us with a donation. To find out more about our work, please go to fairforall.org or fairforall.org/donate to donate directly. Again, the links are in the chat, and the show notes will take you directly there and to some other resources recommended by Dr. Liza and things that we discussed today. So I want to thank you all for joining us today. Really appreciate it. Hope you'll come back next week. We will be talking with psychologist Roger McFarlane again about SSRIs and their adverse effects and what we can do if to other alternatives to treating depression in addition to SSRIs, or if you find yourself in a position where you need to taper off or go off of those. So again, informed consent, that's what we're here for. Thank you so much.